is a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and today we are sitting down to talk about my dissertation. It is 270 pages long, I think, or longer, and it's a lot to read. Not everybody wants to read it, and so I want to make this podcast because I want to have conversations about it with people that I care about deeply. This has not just been researching and reading books for 5 to 6 years. It's visiting places, having conversations with friends, and being involved in some of the beautiful and difficult work that they do. I have friends from across the entire spectrum of all kinds of Anabaptists, but also at different stages and places in their relationship. And it's not a matter of trying to make everyone happy, but to be authentically who I am and where I am in all of this. Because as the researcher, you are very much a person. You're not just like an empty vessel doing like removed objective work. You are involved. You are a part of the story. You are shaping the story. And chapter 1 today is just going to be an overview. It is by no means very heavy. I'll be explaining some of the concepts, like what's a research problem, what's a research question, and like how are you framing, how are you approaching this study. And then chapter 2, please stay tuned because it is a deep dive into the literature. It is a deep dive into Anabaptist and anarcho-pacifist and historical literature, political theology, history, trying to put as much as I can over 5-6 years of research into one chapter of limited length, let's say. I've had to cut it down significantly and summarize all of that, and then have a unique contribution to what I think this way of thinking, this tradition, this approach, this way of doing community is. So, historiography, I realized, especially with Anabaptists and Mennonites, is literally one of the spiciest things ever, apparently. Like, how you interpret history places you on a map. In any case, I think I'm going to start with a research problem that I've expressed in previous conference presentations. This is a quote from Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. I think it's But She Said, written in 1992, page 49. She says, the biblical story of Jesus' suffering and death is held up as a model for Asian women whose lives are filled with suffering and obedience. This author, Chung Hyun Kyung, relates a story about a Korean Sunday school teacher whose life was threatened by domestic violence. The woman testified that she had experienced God's love through her husband's judgment. When she accepted that she had to obey her husband as God's representative, her old self was dead and her new self was born. She concluded her testimony, receiving applause from the congregation, saying, "There have been no arguments and only peace in my family after I nailed myself on the cross and followed God's will." So this is a lot, and it's about domestic violence, but it's actually also about how relationships with other people shape our perception of and relationship with what the research calls a divine attachment figure. The divine attachment figure is something that's used in attachment research and spirituality to talk about how you see and feel and experience God as like in your spiritual life. And I'll give you a little bit more of a definition of that later. But let's look at this story in terms of this Korean Sunday school teacher who saw the judgment and violence of an abuser as an experience of God's love, where God was helping her old self to die and her new self to be born. And God used an abuser to essentially like nail her on the cross and make God's will known. And of course, Fiorenza and Chung that Fiorenza is citing, they engage with this in a very like analytical viewpoint as theologians and interpreters who are Christians and who also probably have lived with and experienced many of the same struggles. Like, how do we perceive of and conceive of God? How do we see God, and what do we see when we see God, especially through other people? And that's going to be a big question, so hold on to that for a second. Let me tell you about the title of my dissertation: Reimagining Anarcho-Pacifist Political Theology Amidst Empires of Imperial Masculine Violence. That's a long sentence, but it's engaging with what I term anarcho-pacifist political theology, which encompasses essentially everyone who believes in non-resistance to evil and following Christ's path of suffering and death as an expression of our rejection of empires and violence and ruling others. Like, it, we'll get into that. And it's specifically centered around the person of the Emperor Constantine in a lot of, like the figure of the Emperor Constantine is the embodiment of imperial masculinity, which is something I'll get into in chapter 3. Chapter 3 is essentially a deep dive into the relationship between gender-based and sexual violence and empire and Constantine, looking at the question. Okay. So the introduction starts with Matthew chapter 5 verse 38 to 44. And if you are familiar with it, the passage essentially says, Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil. But whoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn the other to him also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go 1 mile, go with him twain. 2. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him who would borrow of thee turn not thou away. Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thy enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemy, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. So I begin by saying, this is the passage. I start with the passage. In fact, in my announcement for the dissertation defense, I quote Matthew 5 verse 39, be like, that's the research problem. What do we do? Does turn the other cheek to an abuser, go the second mile, give whatever they ask. What do you do with this in terms of gender-based and sexual violence, which I carefully define in chapter 3, which I will define a little bit in this chapter as well. So this is an excerpt from the Sermon of the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew that defines the stakes of this dissertation. The text essentially prescribes an alternative to lex talionis, which is eye for an eye, divinely sanctioned retaliation for wrong under the Mosaic law. Instead, Jesus prescribes an alternative to the gathered disciples. They should reject retaliation and resistance. Like, don't retaliate, but also don't resist when an evil person comes and wants, is aggressive towards you, is the aggressor. Instead, you should demonstrate love. You should bless the person. You should pray on behalf of them and go beyond compliance. That means go beyond just what they ask of you. Don't just do what they're asking. Do more. Go the second mile. These commandments that Jesus is giving are under the conditions of what I call coercive demand, verbal abuse, bless those who curse you, hatred, persecution, and physical violence. This dissertation thus examines the tradition that formed around a shared interpretation of the text known as non-resistance or non-violence, a tradition that I will address using the term anarcho-pacifist political theology. I keep wanting to add like notes and comments on this text, but this is my opening paragraph. And the term non-resistance is perhaps less popular today. There's a reason why people call themselves Christian anarchists versus non-resistance noun. But the people that you consider Christian anarchists, like Leo Tolstoy, for example, use the term non-resistance. It was a very 19th century term. It is a term of its kind. In Anabaptist perspectives, my friends talked about what terms to use, and they're like, is it non-violence? But it's not really the same as secular non-violence. Is it non-resistance? Is that capture everything about this passage? You're trying to take a whole paragraph here, right? Translate it from the Greek and boil it down to one specific word. My friend Marlon Summers wrote about calling it suffering love, which I think is actually a really good encapsulation of this passage in the Sermon on the Mount. Suffering love. What do you do with this commandment to suffering love? Where does it apply? Where does it not apply? I'm actually more interested in how has it been previously applied by people who believe in suffering love or non-resistance or non-violence. So I termed this anarcho-pacifist political theology, and I'm sure there's a whole load of controversy there. I'm not just looking at Anabaptist writings that promote this specific thing of turn the other cheek, be non-resistant, do not seek power for yourself, like non-resistance as the basis of all your politics, as the politics of Jesus, as John Howard Yoder termed it, as your approach in relationship to the state, is very different from, say, the Protestant approach to applying this passage, which might say you will do this in a personal context, like the Korean Sunday school teacher maybe, that you would do this one-on-one, but you will not apply, like you will not extrapolate from this a larger political theology and orientation towards governmental powers. It kind of has a limit, but it still does really apply to interpersonal relationships in some ways, and there's different limitations on how that is applied. Non-resistance, Anabaptist, anarcho-pacifist, Christian anarchists, they all tend to take this and make a very similar, larger interpretive framework out of it. Again, like the similarities of this approach is going to be the topic of chapter 2, which will be the episode after this, hopefully. But I also start the dissertation with then introducing a picture that is a piece of modern art by Paul Klee, but it actually depicts the story of a suffering Anabaptist who demonstrated love. So I'm just going to flash it to you real quick here, because this picture is also very difficult to figure out who is who. It's difficult to interpret because it is a piece of modern art by Paul Klee, but it depicts a story in Voltaire's Candide, who captures non-resistance in a very empathetic and I think a very sympathetic, accurate portrayal of Anabaptists and how they would wish to be portrayed. So Voltaire wrote this novel called Candide, and in this story, Candide encounters a Protestant couple and asks them for help. He's essentially starving, he's begging, please help me, and then they mistreat him. This is all from Voltaire's perspective, right? So Voltaire is crafting these characters based on how he perceives Protestants and Anabaptists. I will add a side note and anecdote that I'm still trying to find the reference for. One of my friends told me the story about how Voltaire lived in Alsace in France. I've been there, and he was good friends with an Amish bishop named Jacob Kupferschmidt, and he would often go over to Kupferschmidt's house for meals and have conversations with him. And Kupferschmidt was also the bishop under which the Amish followers of Jake Vauban in that area where they fled from Switzerland, they received the first exemption from military service from, I think, the revolutionary French government. So this is during the period of the Enlightenment. This is in the 1700s, and this is a community, a part of France that moved over from Switzerland. So you have the early Swiss Anabaptists. They're being persecuted. They moved from Switzerland to Alsace in France and to the independent city of Strasbourg, where I think Pilgrim Marpeck and several other key Anabaptist leaders either lived or like had important meetings. I forget which meetings those were. But Strasbourg is this really important part of the Reformation history in general. And it's very near to Geneva. Is it? Somewhat. It's near to Switzerland. Anyway, I was there. It's delightful. You essentially, to get to one part of France from this part of France, you have to go through Switzerland. That's how. So Voltaire, right, has some level of familiarity with Anabaptists. So he's portraying this book in which his main character has like a negative relationship with some Protestant people that he encounters. And then he encounters James or Jacob, the good Anabaptist. Is it a coincidence that James or Jacob has the same name as Bishop Kipferschmidt? Maybe or maybe not. Maybe it was like an inside joke between them. I don't know. I'm still trying to find the sources on this. There have been a lot of like uncovering recently of Anabaptists in this area of France. So we'll hold off on that. But let's call him James the Anabaptist. That's the name translated in English. Voltaire describes him as a good Anabaptist who had never been Christianed. And James sees Candide, the main character, who's kind of starving and begging and takes pity on him. So James, quote, took him home, cleaned him, gave him bread and beer, and presented him with 2 florins. And then he encounters another character, a friend of Candide, Dr. Pangloss, who is a beggar, and then Candide encounters Dr. Pangloss, then he takes Dr. Pangloss to James, where James actually pays for his medical treatment. So like, James is a nice guy. He genuinely is a hospitable, kind, charitable Anabaptist at his heart. He is the quintessential good Anabaptist, and I love that. So then they're all on the ship to Lisbon, Portugal, and James, Dr. Pangloss, and Candide, and James counters Pangloss as he makes his argument that everything was so constituted that it could not be better. So James says this, and I'll read the direct translation. It is more lightly, said he, mankind have a little corrupted nature, for they were not born wolves, they have become wolves. God has given them neither cannon of 420-pounders nor bayonets, and yet they have made cannons and bayonets to destroy one another. Into this account I might throw not only bankrupts, but justice which seizes on the effects of the bankrupts to cheat the creditors. So James is talking about the corrupted nature of man, where mankind has created weapons of warfare, but also something to do with economics here, about justice that harms people. And so James is expressing his Anabaptist perspective, that violence is not a good thing. God did not create mankind to be violent. And then suddenly, like, this is a novel, right? So things happen very fast. Right there and then there is a storm. And the storm damages the ship's mast, and everybody has to lend their hand in the midst of this raging thunderstorm, and the ship is tossed to and fro, and the mast is broken, and everyone could die. Well, James is trying to help, and then a, quote, brutish sailor struck him roughly and laid him sprawling. So he's attacked out of nowhere by this brutish sailor, and then the violence of the blow lands the aggressor overboard. So he attacks James, but he gets thrown overboard immediately. James plunges himself into the waters and saves the sailor's life. He manages to save the sailor, and then he dies. And the sailor, the minute that he's saved, does not give a hoot about James. It says that he left him to die without deigning to look at him. So this is a sailor who is violent, who someone saves your life and you do not care. And then James is like the opposite of the sailor, where someone attacks him, he will give his life to save them. If you're an Anabaptist, you know where this is going. You know what the story is saying, right? Uh, so the picture that I showed you is the aftermath of James's death. He dies in this thunderstorm, saving someone else's life, saving the life of someone who was actively just trying to do harm to him out of nowhere. I mean, this is really fictional. This is really like, Voltaire is doing something philosophical here, but that's not my main point. This is not a dissertation about Voltaire. This is a dissertation about the good Anabaptist, the typical Anabaptist, who is the opposite of the so-called villain in Voltaire's narrative. So Voltaire is writing his own version of an Anabaptist martyrology, like an account of like the martyr's mirror, and I think that he is probably writing a character who is in his story the Dirk Willems of his story. I don't know how much Voltaire knew about Dirk Willems, but it sure seems like the real life story of, I wish I had that picture here actually, do I? James saves someone's life saves the life of someone who's actively trying to do him harm. And that is what Dirk Willems did in Holland, in Asperen, where he was in jail. In short, this is recounted in the Martyr's Mirror. He's in Spanish Holland. He's in jail, and he's a fairly young man. Like the records say that the Anabaptist martyrologies, the books, place him at about 15, 17, or 19 years of age. He's a recent convert to Anabaptism, and as all converts are, was definitely overzealous and overexcited. He was baptizing people under the Spanish Catholic rule of Holland and gets put in jail. He constructs himself, like he knots blankets together, throws them out of the window, and somehow manages to climb out and run across the freezing ice. Well, a bounty hunter or guard or somebody who like is larger than Dirk Willems, who has not been starved and was probably older, starts chasing him across the frozen ice, right? Because this is Holland. They filled in a lot of the land with it. What is the term for it? It starts with a D. Anyway, it's a lot of the land is filled with water and frozen at this point because it is the dead of winter. Dirk is almost to freedom when he hears like a splash, right? And the person chasing him has fallen into the ice. So what does he do in that spur of the moment? He turns around, he runs back, and he pulls him out of the ice. And by then, the people on the shore, the leaders or town, magistrates or whatever, tell the bounty hunter whose life has just been saved, arrest him. That's your job. And the bounty hunter does not want to do so, but he does. And Dirk Willems is burned at the stake and suffers a very horrific death that's recorded to be extremely, traumatic and horrific for everyone watching even. And in this case, the person that he saved did not want to arrest him, did not want to do harm, and in fact appreciated his life being saved by this guy who, as a good Anabaptist, has seen somebody in need and sees the person first and decides to help them and save their life. So you can see the parallels between Dirk Willems' story and Voltaire's fictional portrayal. I say, Voltaire is extremely charitable towards Anabaptists. The Anabaptists have won his respect in some way, and he, in fact, sounds like he's understanding their interpretation of Matthew 5, verse 38 to 44. Love your enemies. So then I talk about the term non-resistance, because that's the term that is very widely used in the 19th century to describe exactly this, exactly Dirk Willems, exactly James the Anabaptist. Love your enemies, do good to them that hate you, pray for those who despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. I think it's what it. So the term was used by many people, including Um, Mennonite author Daniel Musser in 1864, writing in the midst of the Civil War, he writes this book called Non-Resistance, asserted he was a member of a sectarian Mennonite group that cut off fellowship with all the Mennonite groups. They are still around. They're in Bluffton, Ohio, and they became their own thing in the mid 19th century, 1800s, Civil War era, and uh, have been on their own since then. Though they're friendly and nice and all that. They're called the Reformed or Herite Mennonites. So Daniel Musser is writing about non-resistance from a Herite perspective. And then at the same time, in around 1869, you have an abolitionist named Adin Ballou, and he also writes about non-resistance. He starts a community called Hopedale, and they're living in somewhere in Massachusetts, I think, trying to live out communal Christian life. He's considered a proto-Christian anarchist. He's a good friend of William Lloyd Garrison, who had similar ideas earlier in his career. Both of these authors, Daniel Musser and Adin Ballou, influenced Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace and I think Anna Karenina, but also What I Believe and The Kingdom of God is Within You. Tolstoy is kind of one of the most well-known theologians of this kind of non-resistant political theology. He's widely read and he influences people beyond this world. So, I begin my dissertation by proposing the problem that non-resistance engenders. What do we do about violence, specifically violence from those in authority who are abusing you, who are being the oppressors and the aggressors? The third party in Dirk Willems' story is actually the Spanish Empire. They have ruled Holland for a long time. Under their rule it was called the Spanish Netherlands, but they were also at the same time starting their colonies and colonial projects in the New World. The Spanish Empire is the reason why Dirk Willems was persecuted. Mennonites under the whatever kingdom it was called, under an independent Netherlands, actually had very many privileges and were integrated into Dutch society, so much so that Rembrandt actually painted some wealthy Mennonites. Like, Mennonites were doing fairly well under Holland. In fact, they were so wealthy that that's why the Martyr's Mirror was written. It was written as this expensive, beautiful book with woodcut illustrations. It's like this amazing, expensive, huge volume, absolutely large, and it is to remind wealthy, prosperous Mennonites of what their faith is, which is a faith, so it's in fact looking from a place of safety back on times when things were less safe, and prescribing a Mennonite ideal that in later chapters we'll talk about is actually less antagonistic towards the abuse of authority than some earlier Anabaptist writings were. Patton Yoder writes about this in a chapter titled The Amish View of the State, and he kind of contrasts the Martyr's Mirror with earlier Swiss Anabaptists writing in the midst of persecution around 1575, but also Pilgrim Marpac. So Daniel Musser, going back to him, he wrote that the non-resistance Christians, quote, duty is to suffer wrong rather than resist evil, end quote. Ballou argued that non-resistants are privileged to endure, quote, physical suffering, end quote, and must follow Christ's example in suffering, quote, every insult, reproach, cruelty, and torture of his enemies with unprovocable patience and unconquerable love, forgiving his most deadly persecutors, and expiring with a prayer upon his lips for their salvation. Ballou is so Anabaptist in the same one, and he really is in many ways. He never identified with, and I don't know if there's any interaction between them, but yeah, it's like, forgive your persecutors, and as you die, you're praying for them. Like, this is a very literal interpretation of Matthew 5, verse 39 to 44 in this non-resistant thing. Tolstoy wrote, quote, "Do not resist evil means never to resist evil. Never offer violence to anyone. If a man reviles you, do not revile him in return. Suffer, but do no violence." So these responses are part of a political theology in which you reject participating in governmental violence, participating in social hierarchies. Tolstoy was very critical of the imperial Russian class system, against the privileging of Christianity within political structures. And yeah, there's a lot of things that you can extrapolate from this core principle of non-resistance, including, which is the problem of my research, what I'm dealing with is what happens when you interpret this passage to tell someone who is not only being physically or sexually abused, but also under conditions of coercive control, which is something that has not really been talked about. Coercive control, where you are even doubting your own self and your own experience of violence, and then tell them, well, your job is to love your enemy, bless those who curse you, suffering love them into Christ, love them into salvation. Some people believe that, not all. But let's talk now about the research problem. So that's the start of the next section, really. So before we go into the research problem that I just introduced, I will say that Anabaptists, Catholic workers, Tolstoyan communities, abolitionists, peace theologies, these all are a conversant body of political theology, meaning that there are many, many similarities. In fact, there's things that are almost identically similar, as I showed you in that quote of the Mennonite, Musser, Adin Ballou the abolitionist, and Leo Tolstoy, the Tolstoy, he's Tolstoy. So previously, the other author who has kind of brought all these into conversations, his name was Alexandra Christoyanopoulos. I have a previous podcast episode with him, and he synthesized this thing and called it Christian anarchism. But really, in later articles, he actually talks about the fact that it's more of a descriptor than it is like a specific movement, because Tolstoy, Ballou, Musser, all these people never call themselves, I am a Christian anarchist and part of the Christian anarchist movement. It was more like, I profess this political theology of non-resistance. He could have called it Non-Resistance, a social commentary in the Gospels. He called it Christian anarchism, which, there are good reasons for that too, but I just use a more adjective type description as anarcho-pacifist political theology. You could call it anarcho-pacifist ecclesiology, anarcho-pacifist spirituality, the anarcho-pacifist tradition. These are all potential, you can use different terms, make good reasons why you use those terms. I think engaging with Anabaptism writ large as part of this larger political theology is something that I chose to do because it's different, and there are a couple of different literary reasons why I chose that. It's particularly to situate Anabaptism within a larger history of the church from late Roman antiquity in the time of Constantine until the present, which we'll get to in chapter 2. So I gave a little summary of anarcho-pacifist political theology in the context of this dissertation. I say it, quote, locates the rationale for non-resistant strategy in the criticism of Christianity as imperium, particularly in response to political favoritism in the late Roman Empire and changes enacted by Constantine I and his successors. Anarcho-pacifist political theology emerged in the earliest rumblings of discontent at the state of the church and Christianity, usually blaming the legitimacy and authority bestowed upon Christianity by late Roman emperors after Constantine I. Articulating this discontent, various theologians brought anarcho-pacifism into being when they began to emphasize the refusal of the violence embedded in the political ecclesial authority under these imperial contradictions, and they also wanted to be an alternative political and ecclesial body, alternative church, alternative politics. So chapter 2 explores how this is now an alternative political ecclesial imagination. That's another term. I could call it the anarcho-pacifist political theological imagination. That's a mouthful. Distinct from the medieval and ascetic monastic movements with whom they share theological histories. Again, that is a problem for for chapter 2. So we're looking at criticisms of this specific turn in Christianity when it was religio illicita, illegal religion, before it became, with the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, it became at least a legal religion. And then in this Constantinian Theodosian era, where Constantine has the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople to establish like what is Christianity, like which Christianity, Trinitarian or Arian. Nicene Christianity is what came out of that. So you have all of that, and then you have the start of medieval Christendom or Corpus Christianum, which is a society that's predominantly Christian, ruled by Christian cultural norms, and where Christianity holds cultural and political power, and the church is also a social and political institution. Under the Eastern Roman Empire, you have more of a theocracy, where the emperor is also kind of like head of the church type thing, and it's slightly different. Like, they're different political arrangements, right? For all the way from 313 CE all the way up until the present, Christendom has many different political structures, many relationships, official and unofficial, integrated, symphonic, as Davor de Jalto calls it, symphonic relations between church and state, many different relationships, but they can all be generally considered Christendom. Then I say anarcho-pacifist political theology responds to Christendom, Christian hegemony, and the Christian imperium, and they prescribe a specific kind of non-resistance centered alternative. Oh, this is quite a lot. I am going to see if I can very quickly. So the question is, are Anabaptists and anarcho-pacifists, or peace Christians, whatever you want to call it, when they locate their criticisms of what's wrong with the church of the present day in its relationship with empires or states or Christendom, because Christoyanopoulos uses the term the state, like the Christian anarchist view of the state. The state being everything from the Roman Empire Constantine to present day nation states under the international relations thing, international state system that we have now. All of these are called the state. I choose to use the term empire because that is relevant to my particular analytical approach. And I would say that, and I start to introduce a little bit about earlier chapters here, but I said there's a specific view of authority and order in this Roman Imperium, in, the Emperor Constantine's way of ruling, in his ideology, in his beliefs about his body and his self, and about the empire, right? The empire is located in the emperor's literal body. That is the state of the nation. It is the strength and virility and glory of the imperial body, but also the rule that he exercises. He is pater patriae. He is the father of the fatherland. He is the empire. And therefore, if we Anabaptists or non-resistance are concerned about this infiltration of the empire into Christianity, then we also need to be concerned about the ideology of the Roman Empire, which I use the term kyriarchy. It kind of encompasses the imperial rule, but also the metaphor and literal rule of Roman households and Roman enslaved people and subjects within Roman households, and all subjects of the larger imperial household. So I said, look, I want to interrogate imperial masculinity, how the emperor views his body in his exercise of sexual violence, which I'll talk about in chapter 3, his view of authority, how do we respond to this from a non-resistant perspective, given that Matthew 5:38 to 44 is the central part of the political theology, non-resistance, and we extrapolate that to mean a certain relationship with Christendom and with empire. So I said, maybe it's a little bit like we haven't brought these two things into conversation. We haven't interrogated our opposition to Constantine and the emperor, but have we then taken that and dealt with his view of the body, his view of rule, authority, and order? We have not really, and that needs to be the conversation. I was just listening to a book by Chaim Rothman about anarcho-Judaism. He talks about the fact that really Tolstoy did not really talk about gender and households and things like that in his work. It wasn't in his purview. It wasn't in his constellation. He wasn't thinking about questions like that. So this is the contradiction. Anarcho-pacifists, on one hand, openly express opposition to involvement in violence, involvement in the state, propagating, pushing the empire's borders, conquest, nationalism. That is very clearly opposed in the political theology. That is not something that Dirk Willems or James the Anabaptist or any Anabaptist would have been for. You have that, but anarcho-pacifists or non-resistance tell members in their community who are experiencing gender-based and sexual violence that you need to turn the other cheek. What do we do with that? Because I believe the connection is in the specific ideology of rule in the Roman Empire, and I'm going to draw that connection over the course of this thesis. So, okay, finally, this is all just section 1.1 titled An Eye for an Eye. Let's have a drink of water. I'm going to, I think, split this, so let's talk about the research problem in the next episode, because I feel like it's better to break things up. This is the stage. This is what I'm actually dealing with, which is what is non-resistance and why am I talking about it. And I will actually kind of really outline my 3 problems with it that I'm dealing with in their dissertation in the next video. Thank you for listening. I thought I would be able to capture all of chapter 1 in one video, but apparently that is not the case.